like Ashish said, I'm the community manager at GitLab. I've been at GitLab for about 15 months, and I had a good fortune of working with a lot of wider community contributors. I think like both Sid and Mark during the keynotes talked about our contributor community. I mean, we have a lot of people, over close to 2,500 people with MRs contributing documentation, code, UX designs even, and also translations. Obviously, open source is pretty close to our core value. And we have a program to support open source projects. We've got several of them represented here. We have a program where for open source projects, we offer our top tier enterprise edition for free, either gold or ultimate. And so we've had a lot of open source communities that have been starting to use and adopt GitLab, which has been great to see. And I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. So George, why don't you get started?
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm George. I'm a core team at GitLab, and I contribute regularly since 2017.
Hi, I'm Molly DeBlanc. I'm the Strategic Initiatives Manager at the GNOME Foundation, where I work with partners, sponsors, and people who are individual supporters of the GNOME Foundation. I also used to have really fabulous blue hair, as you can tell from this picture.
Hi, I'm Paul Brown. I am a communications officer at KDE. We make a desktop environment, and what I do is try and make the world aware that it exists.
Cool. All right, so I think we have a couple of snapshots for those of you who may not be familiar with KDE and GNOME. And if you can flip to the next slide, and I'll let Paul let you talk a little bit more about KDE and your community. If you can advance to the next slide, please. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. So KDE is, who here is familiar with KDE? Hands up who's familiar with KDE. Very good, Molly. Okay, so KDE is not exactly the environment anymore. It is the community. We call the environment Plasma now because KDE does much more than that. Our main product, let's call it that, is the desktop, of course, but we also produce applications and frameworks for developing applications, not only for for Plasma, but also for all sorts of platforms. The thing is that we are a pretty big community. It is difficult to evaluate how many actual people work on, contribute to it, because as a free software community, it is difficult we cannot count all of them, and we don't have employees or anything like that. So that's it, yeah.
And Molly, if we can move to the next slide, and Molly, you can tell us about GNOME.
Sure. GNOME is also, among other things, a desktop environment. In addition, it's an ecosystem of tools and software. We work with GTK, we develop GTK, we work with Flatpak, we host FlatHub, and we have an accessibility toolkit, and I'm happy to talk about all of these in more detail later, as well as like cool things about the desktop environment, and just the general humanitarian and supportive community building work that the foundation is doing. And interested in doing, but I will do that later on an individual basis to not use lots of time.
So, I mean, I think before the introduction, I may have forgotten to poll audience about, I mean, how many people know about the core team in our community, GitLab's core team? So, I mean, core team, I mean, George is you've been a member for a couple of years now. So, I mean, for people that have been making like sustained contribution or sustained and significant contribution over a period of time, we invite them to join the core team. So they're sort of representing the rest of the wider community. We have monthly calls, which you can watch on YouTube. All the recordings are there. And it's really great to have people like outside of from the wider community give us a feedback in terms of not only about our product or how we can improve our community. So when we put this panel together, I thought it would be good to have a representative from the GitLab community. So yeah, apologize, I should have done that sooner. So I'll jump into the question. I'll start with you, Molly. First of all, like I said earlier, our open source program offers like a free enterprise editions, but I think for both GNOME and KDE, you don't use the enterprise edition. So, Molly, do you want to tell us why, like what your requirements are in your community?
So as a community, we had a series of requirements when we were deciding to centralize our contribution system, the technical infrastructure for our contribution system, because previously it had been a bunch of disparate tools. So one of the most important things for us was that it was something we could host ourselves and have it be by the GNOME community for the GNOME community. In addition to that, it was really important that it was free software and that it had a whole list of features and was very extensible and user-friendly, which are like all, the latter ones are all great reasons to choose to work with GitLab. But really being able to host it ourselves was what drove our decision.
What about you, Paul?
Yeah, it's basically the same. We cannot host a framework that is not completely free software. So having proprietary blobs on it is not an option. Working with a community implies most people who work in the KDE community, well, all of the developers are volunteers. All of them do it because they're convinced of the principles of free software, and they would not abide by going with software that has a non-free license. We currently run several tools. We are not so long down the road as GNOME here. We're just starting with GitLab. And there have been long discussions in different groups within the community about the appropriateness of using GitLab. Technically, we know that it is what we want, and we had a good hard look at the licenses and the stuff like that, and we had to go with the free option because it's the only thing that's compatible with our principles.
Okay, cool. And I think a lot of people, when they think about open source projects, they mostly think about code. But obviously, you have infrastructure requirements that go beyond code repositories. So currently, Paul, like you said, you're sort of early in the journey. But besides code repository, what other infrastructure requirements do you have? What kind of other tools do you need?
Well, it's interesting because from KDE's perspective, the main motivator behind going with GitLab was not only a technical one. Obviously, we did talk to the devs and sysadmins and so on, but it was pushed more by our outreach group. One of the requirements was that it be very usable for new contributors. So we use Fabricator, or we have used Fabricator. We're still going to use it because there are certain workflows that we cannot immediately change. We also have stuff that still use Subversion. Again, we cannot change some of that stuff because there are workflows and there are a whole series of things that depend on it. But we are also looking to expand our community. And the way to do that is to have something that new developers that arrive new are familiar with. And this system of forking and then requesting a merge is something that a lot of people are already familiar with and would ease the way into our community. So it's a lot of the decision of going with GitLab was a usable one, not only a technical one. I mean, technically, obviously, it met what we needed, so yes, but we also had to bear in mind how usable it was, and it seems like that it is what we need.
Cool. And Molly, I think we're talking about this yesterday. I mean, you were saying, I mean, there are different groups within like a GNOME community that are using different parts of GitLab. I mean, some are using certain aspects of GitLab and others are not. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So to tell a brief story, the first time I ever used Git regularly was to maintain the books for a startup. And we kept all of our financial files in Git repositories. And that's something that you also are seeing now with the GNOME project, where you're seeing use across teams in a lot of different contexts. So at the end of last week, for example, I uploaded a bunch of files to a repository concerning some of our strategy documents, and then made issues related to them and sent them to my boss. And those are, and it varies team by team. Teams figure out what works best for them. Issue tracking is huge. We keep all of our assets up on our GitHub, or GitLab, sorry. Cringe.
It's okay.
Awkward. Assets for the engagement team and the marketing, we have our conference brochures up there as well. And so we use it not just as a tool for control, like for version control, but across the project, teams are using it as a way to keep a record of their documents and to share things.
So, I mean, changing course slightly, I guess. I mean, George's question for you. I know you contributed to other open source projects as well, and then you've been obviously very active in GitLab community for several years. I mean, what are certain tools that are part of GitLab that are not necessarily used in the GitLab community? I mean, I was just thinking about that yesterday, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, you mean specific features that from GitLab that we are not using, right?
That's a good
well,
place to
there
start,
are a few. We're not heavily using the wiki, or I think we could be more flexible in terms of allowing contributors to add labels or assign people around the team, so they can make it easier for the team to review and move forward the merge requests.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think of open source projects, I often think about wiki, and then one of the first things I learned was that that's not necessarily used a whole lot within GitLab, which is the first thing that I mean, it wasn't a shocker, but it was the first thing that I noticed within the GitLab community, because I was fortunate enough to attend the KDE Academy event last week, and just to add myself to something, I had to go sign on to a wiki and figure out how to use it. But I think that's one of the more common tools used in different communities. But go ahead, Molly.
I'd like to add to that. As a Debian developer, in Debian we use our wiki all the time for everything. And this includes documentation, but it also includes things like signups for the day trip at the conference. Yep. And so even though Debian also uses GitLab, the switch to using the GitLab wiki seems unlikely because there's so much culture steeped in it. And the same thing is true for the GNOME community. We use our wikis, by and large, for things like signing up for the day trip at the conference.
Yep. So, and I think, Paul, you started to touch on this a little bit. I mean, tell me about some of the process involved in your community, and I'll ask the same question to you as well, Molly, tell us about the process involved in deciding to look for a different tool set and making a decision, and who are all involved, and how long did that process take?
It took a long time because communities are, well, it's very varied. It's not like a company where you have this top-down pyramid structure. It's the opposite. You have the mass of the community at the top who are ordering about the guys in the board, and and every opinion must count. Involved in the decision, the first ones who initiated this, as I said, were the outreach, which is not even a technical group within KDE. And then we involved developers, and then we involved sysadmin and the board. board came in, which is supposedly the top tier, they came in at the end. Yeah, the thing is that when we taking this decision, there was lots of backs and forth of we had long lists of what would the advantages be, what would the disadvantages would be, and as I said before, we cannot commit to say, okay, we're going to change over all the way, because apart from the fact that there are workflows that already work and that will have to be somehow migrated, there are always people who prefer their old tools, and that has to be respected, because there are volunteers. You cannot have this top-down thing where you say, okay, everybody has to use GitLab. So there will all these tools will probably coexist for quite a long time, and some will gradually disappear over time, but it's not something that will happen from one day to another or anything like that.
Molly, what about you? I know you did this like more than a year ago, but what was your sort of journey like?
Yeah, so we were using, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of different tools to manage the contribution process. And we decided to centralize for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest ones was that we wanted to make contribution easier, because a lot of people are familiar with the Git workflow and using those tools. We also wanted to have a robust suite of features that would make contribution easier. So it used to be that when you came to the GNOME community, you might have to learn how to use a specific bug tracker, or you would have to learn how to use a specific version control system based on that team. So that was one of our big drives. Another one is we were interested in being able to better track metrics of the project, to have an idea of how many people were contributing, what sort of work they were doing, how many contributors there were, to make bug reporting easier. So for us, choosing GitLab, it was kind of the only option based on the criteria we had, with the two biggest ones being something we could host ourselves and it being free software. So that was kind of like a very brief version of the journey of the decision making.
Cool. And George, I guess, you're in a much different situation. This is you're part of GitLab, that's sort of company-led open source project, very different from KDE and GNOME. So, you can't, obviously you can provide feedback in terms of like what works and what doesn't. How do you go about like providing feedback to the rest of the company, and what are, some of the like changes or suggestions you've been able to make over the past few years?
Okay, so at GitLab, we use heavily the issue tracker. So adding a bug report or a feature proposal starts with an issue, and then you can ping the right people from the right team. We call these stages at GitLab, we create, verify, or secure, for example. And pinging the right people can actually move this feature proposal forward, or get the right people involved in this.
Okay. So moving to sort of the next phase, and Molly, I'll start with you. What were some of the challenges when you were like starting to roll GitLab out to the community and getting them engaged in the new tool set and whatnot?
As we all know, there is nothing like there's no such thing as divisive technology choices within an open source community. And every time you make a decision, everybody agrees it's a great decision. They're all very excited to choose whatever communication client you're picking, whether it's IRC or Slack or Rocket Chat or Matrix or et cetera, et cetera. So I wasn't around for that process, actually. At the time, GNOME had a much smaller staff. But I've talked to people about it, and with any sort of change, there's technical difficulties in migrating all of your repositories to one thing. There's just making cultural adoption to a new piece of software. And there's getting everyone to agree that it's worth making a change in the first place. Much like KDE, even though we do have seven whole staff at the GNOME Foundation, I mean, the project is entirely driven by the community. All the work is done by people who want to be there and who are dedicated to the mission of GNOME and the vision of what the project can be. So the efforts were driven forward by Carlos Serrano, Carlos, who was just, he's a member of the board, but he's an individual who's involved with the project, and he made it happen because there wasn't anyone else to make it happen, but also it's important for the community to be taking these actions and making these decisions.
Yeah. Paul?
Yeah, it's basically it's the same thing. There was again one person, Neophytos Kolokotronis, who is leading the outreach group. That was the one that's, the idea had been floating around for some time. There had been some problems with Fabricator because apparently the development of that platform has slowed down a lot, and we had lost sort of like the channel we had of communication with them, so we were not getting the features that we needed from them, and they seemed to there's some functionality that required going through several hoops that didn't make any sense. It was much more practical to go down to the command line Git and do it there, which sort of defeated the purpose of having a visual web-based interface to start with. So yeah, and this was becoming a serious problem and a serious barrier for new users coming in that had to learn all this interface and all these hoops that they had to jump through, with which they were not familiar at all and didn't seem to have any sense. I mean, it was much easier to do it from the command line. So while using something that they were familiar with, and I'll say the dreaded word because they came from GitHub, right? Sorry about that. Yeah, you've done it, all right. Well, I mean, let's face it. This is the thing that most of the younger developers or new developers were coming from GitHub, and they were totally familiar with this. So this is what, apart from the technical reason, this was as I say, the usable thing to do. It was the best thing to do to stimulate that growth that we needed in the community. Right.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I think we went slightly over than I planned on, but I promised audience questions. So if anybody have any questions, I think Emily can come to you with the microphone. Any questions from the audience, or I can keep going?
I will shamelessly add here that at this point, I like to specifically open questions up for women, non-binary people, people of color, and other people who view themselves as being underrepresented in technology.
Any questions? I don't see any. I can ask one more. So,
go.
While people think of their questions. I mean, obviously, you two are in at different stages of adoption, but what's the feedback so far? And Paul, I'll start with you.
Well, the thing is, we have had more divisive and controversial changes. I mean, as Molly pointed out, changing from adopting matrix over IRC sparked rather, let's call it a vibrant conversation. And that was just changing from one sort of instant messaging platform to another, which we didn't change, by the way. I mean, we still use IRC, but that didn't matter. But in this case, it seems like it's more or less universally accepted that Fabricator does have some features that we like, but it has more features that or are not there or sort of complicated too much, and GitLab on the other hand smooths all these things away. there are some things that we haven't got in GitLab. I have a list here, but I'm not going to read through it. And there are some features that we are going to try and change from Fabricator to, for example, I don't know, the workboards. We use the workboards a lot in the non-technical groups. For example, in my group, which is promotion and communication, we use the workboards a lot. And so GitLab has that. We have to try and migrate the data we have there to there. So that's going to be a challenge. And the wiki we will probably also use.
All right. Okay. Thanks. Molly, what about you?
Sure. Impacts. The anecdata suggests that it has, in fact, made contributing to GNOME easier, and that the number of contributors has increased. We've seen other projects that touch GNOME create GitLab accounts for their projects. So they're also interacting with us in this very direct way within the ecosystem. We have seen, like I mentioned, lots of teams adopting it, adopting use of it. And I, personally really enjoy using Git in general, and GitLab. I think the colors are pretty. And I think I'm not the only person who feels that way.
If I may, talking of the impact, Molly touched on it before. We have serious problems in measuring the size of contributions and the size of our community in general. I mean, I have here a list of figures, but I have really no way to know if this is true or not. I mean, we have we mirror our some of our projects onto GitHub. And there are 936 projects from KD on GitHub, but these are the public ones. We don't know how many private ones there are. We don't know how many subversion projects, repositories are. We have an idea of how many commits we have on our Git repositories, but we don't know how many we have on our subversion repositories. It is really, really difficult for a community that has several different tools to know how big they are. And this is really essential because we don't know if we're actually growing or if we're contracting or we're staying the same over the years. So, Pardon? No, nothing.
I think it was just a backline.
I have a question for Molly. Since you have switched to GitLab, are you using other features of GitLab, like GitLab CI?
Yes, we talked about. I was trying to figure out how to work that in actually, and then I forgot about it. We're using GitLab CI continuous integration for testing, and it's been super awesome, and everybody has said wonderful things about it. So thank you.
Good to hear.
Right. Thanks for doing my job. But I mean, this might be the last question. I mean, question for you, George. I mean, what are some of the things that we can do better in the GitLab community? Are there something like in terms of tooling or work processes that we need to improve to lower the barrier to entry? I mean, that seems like for both GNOME and KDE community, I was surprised. Like onboarding and lowering the barrier to entry was like one of the criterias. And what are some of the things that we can do better within GitLab community?
So you should know, the quality team at GitLab uses some automations that allow automatic labeling and triaging issues and merge requests. This is something that it can definitely be improved, so that community contributors can actually benefit from these automations, like asking for a review from a specific person or labeling the merge request with the right labels. So,
I had an addendum to that. What was the question? The question was.
I mean, how can we?
Oh, right. I've heard from a number of people that it would be really great to be able to link issues to one another.
We already do that.
Yes.
Wait,
It's already possible.
Maybe I'm thinking about something else. Well, that was embarrassing.
I know there's a problem sharing tasks across projects.
Oh, maybe that's it.
I think that's it. So you, sorry to bring up the competition again, but in Fabricator you can create a task and you can assign it to a project, and then you can assign it to another project too that will participate in that task. And I think you can't do that with GitLab yet.
Yeah. No, I think one of the things that we work with the KDE community on was like a group level issue board. So that one's been backported to Community Edition.
Okay.
But there are other things that we're having discussions on. But yeah, I mean, I knew that was a key requirement from KDE.
So if that's a deal breaker, folks, it's solved. So.
So cool. I know we're out of time. I don't know if like audience members have any questions. Any questions or, I mean, hopefully this gave you a different perspective. This is not like a typical like an enterprise environment, but if you think about it, there are definitely like similarities in open source communities and like a traditional like enterprise customers, but there are definitely like differences in terms of like choosing the tool and rolling it out to the community. So well, thanks for your time. I guess we'll wrap it up.